In 1966, the U.S. Army built one of their biggest bases in Vietnam, right on top of 250 kilometers of enemy tunnels underneath the ground. They had no idea the tunnels were even there. For months, American soldiers were being killed every single night inside their own base. The same thing kept happening. When it got dark, there would be explosions and gunfire. But by morning, the enemy was completely gone. No footprints, no dead bodies, nothing. Army leaders searched the jungle every single day and found absolutely nothing. Then one group of soldiers found a small hole hidden under leaves, and that's when everything finally made sense. Just think about that for a moment. The United States spent over $168 billion fighting in Vietnam. They dropped more bombs on that country than all the bombs dropped in World War II put together. And still, a system of dirt tunnels, dug by regular people using simple tools, changed the whole war. This is the story of how those tunnels were built, why nothing could destroy them, and the one thing the US military never figured out until it was already too late. Let's go back to the 1940s. Vietnam was under French colonial rule, and the Vietnamese people had already been fighting for their freedom for years. They started digging. Small tunnels at first, just enough to hide weapons, move fighters, and stay alive. But when the Americans showed up in the 1960s, those tunnels became something nobody had ever seen before. The Cu Chi district, just 40 kilometers outside of Saigon, became the most tunneled piece of land on Earth. Over 250 kilometers of tunnels, that's longer than the distance from New York to Philadelphia, all underground, all hidden, all connected. And here's what made them terrifying. They weren't just tunnels, they were cities. Inside those tunnels, there were hospitals performing surgeries, there were kitchens cooking food, there were meeting rooms where military strategy was planned. There were weapon factories building bombs. People were born down there. People lived their entire lives underground. While American soldiers were walking above them on the surface, an entire civilization was operating right beneath their boots. The US military knew they had a serious problem, so they tried everything they had. First came the bombs. Operation Arc Light sent B-52 bombers to carpet bomb the Cu Chi region so heavily the ground shook like an earthquake. And the Vietnamese, they just went deeper. The tunnels had 3 levels. The deepest level was 9 meters underground. Bombs couldn't reach it. They even dug the tunnels in a zigzag pattern so that if a bomb did get close, the blast wave couldn't travel around the corners and kill everyone inside. Then the US tried flooding the tunnels with water. The Vietnamese had built the tunnel floors at a slight downward angle, so water just drained away. They tried pumping in poison gas next. The Viet Cong simply sealed sections off with trapdoors and waited. Every single idea the US threw at those tunnels, the tunnels had already thought of a counter, but the most brilliant detail, the thing that still blows people's minds today, was the kitchen ventilation system. Cooking underground creates smoke, and smoke coming out of the ground is basically a giant arrow pointing at your location. So the Vietnamese engineers designed the kitchen chimneys to run horizontally through hundreds of meters of tunnel before finally releasing the smoke through tiny holes in the ground, far away from the actual kitchen. American soldiers would see a faint wisp of smoke, investigate, find nothing, and walk away, while the kitchen kept cooking just meters below their feet. After all of that failed, the US military was left with only one option. If the bombs couldn't go deep enough and the water drained away and the gas got sealed off, then they had to send actual human beings in. And that decision changed everything. They needed men with a very specific body, small, lean, narrow shoulders. The tunnels were only 60 to 80 centimeters wide. A standard American soldier in full combat gear couldn't even fit through the entrance. So, the Army started looking for the smallest men in each division, soldiers who under any other circumstance would have been told they were too small for combat. Down here, their size was the only thing that mattered. They called themselves tunnel rats. Nobody gave them that name, it just fit. Before going in, they stripped down completely. No helmet, no body armor, no rifle, because a rifle couldn't be aimed in a space that narrow and couldn't be turned around if something came from behind. Everything stayed above ground. What they took in was a Colt 1911 pistol, 1 spare magazine, a flashlight, and sometimes a knife. That was it. The entire power of the United States military, reduced to 1 handgun and a battery-powered light. They developed their own rules because nobody above them had any idea what they were actually facing. Move slowly because every centimeter of tunnel floor could be a pressure plate. Use the flashlight as little as possible because light travels far in a tunnel. If you can see, you can be seen. And if you hear movement ahead, stop, wait, and let your ears tell you how far away it is before you do anything. What they found inside was beyond anything they had been told to expect. The Viet Cong had spent 20 years preparing those tunnels for exactly this situation. The first thing most tunnel rats encountered wasn't an enemy soldier. It was a trap, sharpened bamboo stakes coated in poison, buried in shallow pits covered with a thin layer of dirt. You'd put your hand down to crawl forward and it would go straight through into the pit. Some pits had stakes pointing both up from the floor and down from a false ceiling, so you'd crawl into the space between them without realizing it until you tried to move. Then there were the animals. The Viet Cong placed bamboo vipers in clay pots rigged to door frames. Open the door, and the pot falls, the paper seal tears, and a snake lands on you in complete darkness. Soldiers learned to open every door from the side with a knife first. Scorpion boxes hung from ceilings on threads too thin to see without a light. Walk through the thread, and the box opens above your head. And beyond all the traps, there were Viet Cong soldiers who had lived in those tunnels for years. They could move through them in complete darkness at a speed that seemed impossible. Tunnel rats reported hearing movement ahead, waiting in silence for several minutes, and then feeling displaced air as someone passed within arm's reach in the dark, without making a single sound. Firefights happened at distances of 2 to 3 meters, sometimes less, in near-complete darkness. The psychological damage was unlike anything else in that war. Above ground, soldiers dealt with fear and exhaustion. Below ground, they dealt with something much older. The fear of tight spaces, the fear of total darkness, and the fear of not knowing what was right in front of their face. Most tunnel rats came back changed in ways they couldn't explain to people who had never been down there. The nightmares weren't about the firefights, they were about the silence, the darkness, and the sound of breathing that wasn't theirs. By the time the war ended in 1975, those tunnels had survived everything. The people who built them with basic tools had outlasted the superpower that tried to destroy them with every weapon short of nuclear. It wasn't luck. It wasn't stubbornness. It was pure, disciplined, creative thinking from people who understood their land better than any outsider ever could. The Cu Chi tunnels are still there today. You can visit them. You can crawl through a section of them. And when you're down there, crouching in the dark, barely able to move, remember that people lived, fought, and survived in those tunnels for over a decade, against the most powerful military force the world had ever assembled. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest one, sometimes it's the one nobody thinks to look for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It's just as wild as this.